I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're going way back in time now. In fact, yes, this is actually more your field than mine because you're the one studying it right now. But how far back are we going?
It's not my field.
No.
I do slightly earlier than you do, but I'm still modern.
You're the one studying it with Dr. Haberstad. So,
Yu Gong.
Mm-hmm.
Yu Gong is interesting. So Yu is the name of an ancient Chinese political leader, king, something or another. He's largely a mythological figure. We hear about him first. I believe the text that we're looking at today, the Shangshu, the Book of Documents, as it's often translated, is the oldest appearance of Yu. And Gong is just tribute, I guess. Yeah. So it's an interesting, from a political standpoint, it's almost more of a political document than a piece of literature. But we're going to make the argument that it is part of Chinese literature.
And because we've already got a podcast on exams, so why not broaden the field a little bit? Exactly. But I feel like we should be very careful today to use the right tones with you. Otherwise, it's going to sound like we're addressing each other. Like, this is back when you were digging the ditches and canals in eastern China.
Which you have done, right?
Which I have done. No, I haven't done. Right. So this is a longer passage, and I should mention the translation we're working with is done by a professor here at the University of Oregon, Luke Haberstad, under the auspices of the very well-known Michael Nyland,
who's, I think, one of the greatest authors, one of the greatest scholars on early Chinese literature living today.
Yeah, her book on the 5 Confucian classics is incredible.
And we should point out, though, the name is Michael. It's a
woman.
Her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, this is a really interesting translation, or a really interesting text. Let's give a little bit of background about the Shangshu.
Go for it.
So the Shangshu is interesting. It's this collection of documents that is maybe 3,000-4,000 years old. It's one of the oldest works that's still around from, in Chinese. It is interesting because the works that claim to be the oldest are actually the youngest. So the works that there are some Western Zhou texts. So Western Zhou, we're talking about late 800s, maybe something like that, BCE. But this text was probably a Warring States text. So it appears that there were some documents that were a kernel of a series of documents that were, even at the time, they were collected pretty friggin' old.
Mm-hmm.
And then they whoever was collating these possibly added these on. But this is interesting. This is probably you. So that's third tone. So you is probably, I think we should think of him as largely a mythological figure. He is, the sage king from the early Chinese period that, everybody looks up to.
So we're looking at almost like a King Arthur figure where, technically I think there was a historical figure named Arthur, but of course it was nothing like the stories. So.
And we don't know that much about him or whether or not Arthur actually existed.
Right.
So I think Arthur is a good basic comparison.
Okay.
What did you do, though? He is walking around, so the Yu Gong is him walking around, essentially delineating different parts of China. He divides China up into 9 different Zhou, or Zhou.
Z-H-O-U, Zhou.
Yeah. For example, those of y'all who are familiar with cities like Hangzhou,
Suzhou, yeah.
Those are all this Zhou. So it eventually, Zhou came to mean state, but it appears first here as kind of like province of this united empire. But I want to emphasize that this is an imagined empire. We don't really have any indication that this is really something that's going on. So he divides up the land, and he also creates this network of canals and irrigation networks. And it's fascinating because those of y'all who read Chinese will know that 治, so that's fourth tone, means to govern.
Like 政治.
Yeah, 政治. That actually has the word that actually has the water particle. And for a long time, I was trying to figure out why, what does rulership have to do with water? And one of the arguments that I've heard made is that because of you, there is, or you is this mythological way of representing the importance of water to Chinese civilization. Mm-hmm. Before you could control the floods, before you could sort of do irrigation and things, it was really hard to have a large society or a society on a large scale.
And so it makes a lot of sense that one of the great, possibly mythological rulers or ruler figures in Chinese history is the one who controls the water.
Exactly. He's the first one to actually figure out how to do it. Mm. And this is the text where he does it. So yeah, I think that it comes out of that tradition.
Mm. You want to read a little bit of this?
I don't think we can read any of it. Do you think we should?
I was just going to read some of Luke's translation because I really think it's a very solid translation. You can still see Michael Nyland's comments in the margin, so clearly it's very high quality. But
how about this? We'll read part of it in a second, but I want to go just kind of over what exactly happens.
Yeah.
So he goes to various different places. It's talking about mountains. We know some of these places. Like a lot of these places are still places that we know. Mm-hmm. He travels mostly by river, which there's a work by a Thai scholar named Thong Chai, who he actually talks about in Thailand. The rulers, like all maps were given from the perspective of rulers traveling by rivers. And I think this could be sort of an early form of that. This is you going, and he goes upriver to these different parts of China, and he lists what they do well, what kind of natural resources they have, what they can pay in taxes, what they can pay in tribute. So this is actually sort of tax collecting as literature. It's kind of weird.
And it's interesting to read, and I'll just jump in here and you can go back to your summary, but that one of the things that marks each territory is how it's useful.
How it's useful to the center.
To the center, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Its ability to produce goods and services and taxable items. Yeah. And this is such a fascinating concept because this is one of the oldest documents that Chinese culture possesses, at least oldest intact documents it possesses. And it's talking about the commercial usefulness of the land. A lot of our oldest documents...
I wouldn't say it's commercial usefulness. It's almost... it's government kind of tribute system useful.
Okay.
So, but you're right, yeah.
Yeah. A lot of our oldest documents about the natural world attempt to attribute value or to a natural item or natural thing that's inherent or implicit, or perhaps because it was created.
When you say our...
European, United States.
So, there's definitely Greek. That. So I was going to point out Greece. The first work of Greek that we have is, I believe, written on an urn, and it's a urn that's given in a poetry contest. It's a prize for a poetry contest. And I think that's one of the things that sets off Greece from other civilizations. But if you go back and look at Babylon, all the earliest texts that we have are tax collecting texts.
That's true.
And, I think this can be seen in a sort of similar vein. And this is happening at approximately the same time. Literature started out as a kind of, written language started out as a kind of tax collection. It was a way for recording things. And then it slowly becomes literature. And I think what we're witnessing here maybe is that transformation from what we would just think of as boring old tax collection to mythology or literature or something.
So we start with the practical and move into the abstract.
I think so, yeah. I didn't really have that much more else as far as a summary. He's cutting channels. He's talking about the soil. He's talking about the kind of fish, the products that they produce. I'm interested in how this group, the E, so there are several different kind of E, and E is just Aboriginal, or I'm sorry, it's more like ethnic minority is the word that we would use today, but they don't really seem like they're that much of an issue here. It's just kind of being recorded that these people are called the bird-ese or the lie-ese or whatever. But I was wondering if we could read the last bit, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
So we don't really, I guess I should explicitly say this, we don't really know that much about how this text was produced. The thing about it is, we believe linguistically they've pretty much proven that it's a much later text than it purports to be, but we still don't know really what's going on here. There may actually be bits and pieces of this text that are older or that are, younger. It could actually be an accretion, sort of different texts kind of stapled together and saying, like, this is one text about you. And we just don't know that much. And I feel like this end part is really interesting. Mm-hmm. So he's talked about like going to the 7 Zhou and kind of doing tax collection and tax assessment, essentially. And then there's this interesting part. I'll read it out. The zone within 500 li of the capital is the royal domain. Within the first 100 li, revenues are received in the form of whole grain stocks. Within the next section of the zone extending to 200 li, they are received in the form of ears of grain only. Within the next section of the zone extending to 300 li, they are received in cut ears of grain with the bran. Within the next section of the zone extending to 400 li, they are received in unhusked millet. Within the next section of the zone extending to 500 li, they are received in the husked millet. And this goes on and on for a few more paragraphs. I don't think we need to read anymore. I think you get the idea. So what I find fascinating about this is you go and you're talking about these different zhou, which are all contributing taxes to the center, but there's not really this kind of hierarchy. But here, this hierarchy is explicitly stated, and there's no discussion of the zhou. There's nothing going on about the zhou here. It's just about how far you are from the center. And increasingly, we go on, and the tribute gets less or kind of crappier, I would say. I mean, they're not the tributes aren't as good. Things don't travel as far, I guess. And we go out farther into these areas with the Yi, the ethnic minorities, and then Man, a different kind of ethnic minority, I guess. And then we're out into the wilderness, and into the high, the sea. So there's a fascinating thing going on here as far as kind of power hierarchies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to see it established this early. And it's arguably still the case today that the closer you get to Beijing, for example, the tighter restrictions are.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating because it's not simply a matter of, say, lack of technology in the rural areas. This is very much a culturally rooted prejudice that the power has a center.
Yeah. And
everything rings out from that.
The line that I think of in Chinese is 天高皇帝远. The heavens are high and the emperor is far away.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I did want to talk about, so this is kind of an abstract text, but to bring it home, and the thing that's always fascinated me is I'm interested in ethnic groups and kind of ethnic relations between Han and non-Han Chinese people. And the thing that fascinates me about this text is I still see this. Everywhere I go in China, you hear people talk about their 特色. Every place has a 特色, and that's the thing that you're supposed to bring back. And I think that this is maybe coming out of that. I mean, tribute is not something that's unique to Chinese culture. Lots of cultures have this tribute system, but I would say it has a very long and very important resonance in Chinese culture, and specifically when you're talking about ethnic minorities. Like if you watch the the Chunwan, the New Year's the New Year's Eve party. They always have ethnic minorities coming out to dress in their specific clothes, those clothes that ethnic minorities have to dress in. Otherwise, they're not presenting themselves as ethnic minorities. And I think to a certain degree, that comes from this kind of, if not this text specifically, the kind of thinking that this text produces.
It's an interesting thought because, for example, you'll have the sort of ethnic minority parks, where they'll have like
Absolutely.
a Hui village. It's sort of like Epcot Center, but meant to be sort of quote unquote more cultural.
Yeah.
But it's sort of cultural tourism.
Yeah.
And a group is very much identified by its 特色. The 特色 we keep using here in Chinese literature is like specialty product or a thing but it is a thing. And every region has its thing.
And that's the only acceptable way to know that region. That's the only acceptable way for that region to be authentic. And it's designated. It's very well known. There's no kind of like ifs, ands, and buts about it.
If Shanxi has noodles. Everybody knows that Shanxi produces the best noodles. Yep. Whether that's actually true or not is whatever. But
I guess, the point is there's this discourse that develops, and it's a kind of tribute discourse.
You are identified by what you give to the center in this case. But, now it would be what you produce for the national economy. Everyone knows that this comes from this place, this other thing comes from this other place, and that if you're from Tianjin, for example,
you have to give, what is it?
Gobuli Baozi. Like you're from Tianjin, Gobuli Baozi. That's how everyone knows Tianjin. No one goes, oh, Tianjin. That's where the Boxer Rebellion, et cetera. That doesn't happen.
Kunming is the same way. You have Over the Bridge noodles.
Over the Bridge, which are amazing, by the way. Man, I forgot about those. Now I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Anyway. Those really are good.
Yeah.
Some of these products are really good. But that's really
and it's not about good or bad.
No, it's not.
I think that's the point. It's just the fact that it's designated as this thing. And this is the only thing, or these specific things are the only thing that we can talk about being your 特色.
Yeah. And I think a final thought I had was simply the fact that, as you mentioned, some of the oldest texts in Babylon are tax documents. And so far as I know, are written as tax documents, right? This is a semi-legendary trip around China by a ruler who himself apportions out how things are supposed to work. Here's how the canals will work, etc. It's almost a godlike feat. And there's a sense in which even this very, very ordered tribute system is the subject of just mystification.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you put something in story form, particularly this mythological form, it lends the state an air of sort of supernatural power. They're not necessarily determined by tribute. They're determined by this mythological figure who gave them the tribute system. So it lends it this extra sense of aura, I suppose.
There are actually versions of this myth that are more kind of spiritual, God, like I don't want to say more mythological because I think this is mythological, but this is very much an administrative text as a tax document. But there are other versions of this myth where he goes to the different regions. He goes to the different regions and is protected by the local deities, and there's something going on there. So this myth comes out in very, very different ways, and I think you're absolutely right to point to that as a kind of spiritual, mythological, God-related text. There's something going on there.
Yeah, I agree. Final thoughts?
I think that this is an interesting way to think about contemporary issues. Even though this is an incredibly old text, I don't think that the listener should be afraid to approach it because it opens up, just as the exams of the Song Dynasty open up some of the issues with the Gaokao in China. I think this opens up a lot of stuff that's still going on today. And Chinese people, even if they can't read this, and we should be clear on the language here, like it's not just hard for us to read. This is impossible for an educated Chinese person to read. You have to be a specialist, pretty much, to understand what's going on. And even specialists debate about what's actually the meaning of these different words.
Right.
But even though your everyday, Chinese man on the street is not reading this for, pleasure at bedtime, this is still affecting what goes on in China.
Yeah. Especially since for the vast majority of Chinese history, dynasties looked to the past to order the present. And so this document was never old history. Now we have to revive it. It was always very much contemporary in the minds of rulers. And even now, we may be about 150 some odd, 200 years removed from that philosophy, but you don't erase 2, 3 or so thousand years of a perspective in about 200 years. So this is still very much contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we'll call it.
All right.
I'm Lee Moore,
And I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.